Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtains on the strange, half-forgotten sleep tricks of the Second World War. The ones exhausted soldiers whispered to each other in foxholes, traded in letters home, and swore could put a man under in 90 seconds flat, even with artillery thudding in the distance. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this, because this is the kind of slow, quiet, history-soaked channel that only really works for the people who genuinely want it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love reading those in the morning. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. And if your blanket feels a little heavy tonight, good. Think of it as a borrowed greatcoat. Drop your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Let your tongue rest soft behind your teeth. We're going to borrow something the British paratroopers were reportedly taught before a night drop. A slow 4-4-8 breath. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4. Breathe out long and soft for 8. Just once more if you like. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, that's a victory. My voice will get quieter and slower as the hours go on, and the story will keep going softly until morning. It begins now. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a Royal Navy sailor managed to sleep in a hammock, slung 6 inches from a diesel engine, the whole ship groaning around him, and still wake up rested? Have you ever wondered what it felt like to close your eyes in a trench in Belgium, knowing the next sound you heard might be a shell? And somehow, still drift off. What if the strange little trick Tommy Atkins used in his muddy dugout could work tonight, in your own warm bed, with no modification at all? Did you know that Soviet snipers, buried in the snow for hours, trained themselves to sleep with their eyes half open? Have you ever imagined falling asleep standing up, leaning against a sun-warmed stone wall in Naples, rifle propped between your knees, because you had not lain down flat in 11 days? What did RAF bomber pilots chew to keep their hands steady on a long run over Berlin? And what did they chew back at base to switch themselves back off again? Why did American GIs carry a single small stone in their pocket all the way from Normandy to Nuremberg and touch it every night before sleep? How did a nurse at Anzio learn to sleep through shelling by quietly counting the names of saints? Why did German U-boat crews, 50 men in a steel tube, share the same warm mattress in rotating shifts? And did the smell really bother them, or did it become strangely comforting? And the question I keep coming back to, is it genuinely possible that an 80-year-old trick invented by an exhausted teenager in a wet hole in the ground could outperform every sleep app on your phone? Stay with me. All of these answers, and many stranger ones, are coming. Slowly, quietly, no urgency, no test, just listening, or not listening, as sleep decides. So let's drift back. Not far at first. Back past last year, past 2005, past the hum of 1989, past the long golden afternoon of 1969. Back and back and back, until the calendar on the wall reads September 1939. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1939. The wireless is crackling in the parlour downstairs. Mr. Chamberlain is telling the country, in that slow, tired voice, that we are now at war with Germany. A woman 2 doors down is hanging heavy black curtains against the window. The air smells of paraffin and boot polish, and someone's burnt toast. On the kitchen table, a canvas kit bag is already half-packed, with a tin mug balanced absurdly on top. For the next 6 years, 70 million human beings are about to share one very old, very simple problem. How on earth do you get any sleep at all? Good luck. So you pull your coat tighter and step, in your mind, into the strange, shivering autumn that follows. The first thing you notice is that the war you were promised has not actually arrived. Poland has fallen in a matter of weeks. Yes, the newspapers are full of grim maps and arrows. But here in the west, along the Franco-Belgian border where the British Expeditionary Force is slowly digging in, nothing much seems to be happening. The French call it the drôle de guerre, the funny war. The Germans call it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. The British, with their usual genius for understatement, call it the phony war. And for almost 9 months, from September 1939 to May 1940, that is exactly what it is. A war that will not start. A war of waiting. A war, it turns out, of trying very hard to sleep. Because here is the thing no one warns you about when they send you off to fight. You spend far more nights trying to close your eyes than you will ever spend firing a rifle. And that autumn and winter, it becomes the coldest winter Europe has seen in 100 years. Rivers freeze solid. The Seine grows a crust of ice. The Thames, in places, freezes at the edges. Canals in Belgium become skating rinks. And somewhere along a damp farm track in Flanders, a young corporal from Manchester is lying in a requisitioned barn, listening to the cows breathing in the dark, trying to work out whether it is colder inside his blanket or outside it. Now, this is the moment, quietly, almost invisibly, when modern military sleep doctrine is born. Because the generals have noticed something. Bored soldiers do not sleep. And soldiers who do not sleep are, to put it politely, useless. They shoot the wrong people. They drop things. They fall off horses. They forget the passwords. They write letters home that are so miserable the censors have to confiscate them just to keep morale afloat. So for the first time in modern military history, somebody sits down and writes a manual about it. The 1939 British Army Field Guidance introduces a phrase that sounds almost comical to modern ears, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. Rest discipline. The idea is simple and, frankly, a little heartbreaking. Sleep is a weapon. Sleep has to be rationed, protected, practiced. If you waste your sleep, you waste your war. Junior officers are told in so many words to treat a sleeping man under their command the way a farmer treats a field, as something precious, something in limited supply, something not to be trampled unless absolutely necessary. And somewhere in Chicago, quietly, a biologist named Nathaniel Kleitman is watching all of this with very tired eyes. Kleitman is the father of modern sleep science, the man who 2 years earlier had descended into Mammoth Cave in Kentucky with a colleague to see what happened to the human body when it was cut off from daylight. Military physicians on both sides of the Atlantic begin, slowly, to read his papers. They do not understand all of it, but they understand one thing clearly. Sleep has a shape. It comes in cycles, and if you fight against those cycles, the cycles will fight back. Meanwhile, far to the north, in a country most of the world has never really thought about, a different and much harder war is starting. On the 30th of November 1939, the Soviet Union invades Finland. Stalin expects it to last 2 weeks. It lasts 3.5 months. And in those months, the Finns teach the rest of the world a masterclass in cold weather sleeping that military manuals are still quietly quoting 80 years later. Picture it. Imagine you are a Finnish ski trooper under the command, loosely speaking, of a quiet, small-statured farmer named Simo Heiha, who will end the war with more confirmed sniper kills than anyone in recorded history, and who, in his free time, prefers to stay very still and think about nothing in particular. The temperature is somewhere around -40. At that temperature, Celsius and Fahrenheit finally agree with each other on something, which feels like a small kindness from the universe. You cannot sleep on the snow. You will die. You cannot sleep above the snow. You will die faster. So you do what your grandfathers did. You dig. You scrape out a shallow trench in a drift, a thing the Finns call a kami, barely big enough for your body. You line it with spruce boughs. And this is genuinely clever, because spruce boughs do two things at once. They lift you off the ground just enough to break the thermal bridge, and they release a faint aromatic oil into the cold air around your face, a clean green smell that, it turns out, quietly calms the nervous system. 80 years before anyone sells you a pine-scented pillow spray, a teenage Finn is pressing his cheek into a branch of spruce and finding it makes him sleepy. You sleep in 2-hour shifts. Not because 2 hours is ideal, it isn't, and your body knows it isn't. But because any longer and your core temperature slides to somewhere you cannot come back from. Your partner shakes your shoulder. You swap places. You crawl into the warm hollow he has just left. The human body, it turns out, is a very effective portable radiator, and the Finnish army is one of the first in modern history to use this knowledge systematically. And before you lie down, you eat a lump of butter, just plain butter, sometimes wrapped around a sliver of smoked reindeer. Every Finnish mother knows this. Every Finnish grandmother knows this. The body burns slow fat all night long, like a little wood stove under the ribs, and a soldier who has eaten butter wakes up warmer than one who has eaten bread. If you have ever wondered where the modern idea of a bedtime fat snack comes from, the almond butter on toast, the spoonful of coconut oil in the warm milk, tip your hat quietly to a Finnish ski trooper in a snowdrift in 1940. The Red Army, across the line, is learning the opposite lesson in the harshest possible way. Soviet sentries, bundled in inadequate greatcoats, are freezing to death standing up, rifles locked to mittens, eyes open, along the Mannerheim line. It is one of the grimmest sentences anyone has ever had to write in a military report. They did not fall asleep at their posts. They simply stopped. Let us move, gently, south. South through forest and frozen farmland, south through the grey stone towns of eastern France, until we are standing at the entrance of one of the strangest architectural projects humanity has ever undertaken. The Maginot Line. A chain of concrete fortresses stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg, built between the wars at staggering expense to make absolutely sure the Germans would never, ever invade France the way they had last time. Which is almost, but not quite, the same as saying useful. Inside the Maginot Forts, underground, you find young French soldiers living something close to an early prototype of the modern submarine experience, only worse, because a submarine at least moves. The forts do not. They hum, they drip. The ventilation recycles the same cold, damp air through kilometers of concrete corridor. The lighting is a flickering early fluorescent, the kind that gives you a headache by lunch and a dull ache behind the eyes by dinner. There is no day. There is no night. There is only shift change. The French army doctors, God bless them, coin a lovely phrase for what happens to men who live like this. Le mal du béton, concrete sickness. Soldiers report that they cannot tell if they have slept for 4 hours or 14. Their dreams become strange and flat. They lose their appetite. Young men in their 20s start waking up exhausted. And the French Medical Corps, reaching into a pharmacy older than the war itself, prescribes tisanes. Linden flower for the jitters, valerian root for the nerves, chamomile for the stomach. A soft, warm herbal drink at lights out, passed around in tin mugs, the kind of remedy a grandmother would recognize from 1,000 years of European kitchens. And it works, sort of. Not enough, but sort of. Now cross the border, carefully into Germany, where something much darker is being stirred into the morning coffee. In April 1940, just weeks before the great German offensive that will shatter everything, the Wehrmacht begins issuing a small round tablet to its soldiers. The official name is Pervitin. The soldiers call it Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate. It is, straightforwardly, methamphetamine. 35 million tablets will be distributed to the German military in the first 3 months alone. A single tablet keeps a tired man alert for 8 to 12 hours. 2 tablets turn a tired man into a marching machine for a day and a half. The drug is not a secret. It is advertised in German chemist shops. A company called Temmler makes it. Housewives take it for their housework. And here is where it gets quietly interesting for our purposes. Because the Germans, being meticulous, realize almost immediately that you cannot run a human being on amphetamine forever. You have to bring him back down. So, alongside Pervitin comes a counter-ritual, a sleep ritual, that is almost sweetly domestic. Warm milk, honey, a few drops of baldrian, which is the German word for valerian. Sometimes a splash of brandy if the medic is feeling generous. And a platoon sergeant, more often than you might expect, reading aloud in the darkened barrack room. The reading material, remarkably, is not military. It is Goethe. It is Schiller. It is sometimes the softer poems of Rilke. A boy of 19 wound tight as a watch spring on methamphetamine and fear, lying in a bunk in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Aachen, listens to his sergeant murmur lines about wanderers and linden trees until his breathing finally slows. It is the kind of detail you might not believe if you read it in a novel. And yet the letters home, preserved in archives in Freiburg and Munich, mention it again and again. The sergeant read to us, and then we slept. Meanwhile, out at sea, the Royal Navy is quietly discovering something that would end up in every modern sleep science textbook. In the North Atlantic, on the long, dark blockade patrols, British ratings are living in 4-hour watches. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. It is brutal at first. The body hates it. But over weeks, something unexpected happens. Their sleep becomes denser, more efficient. They learn to fall asleep within minutes of climbing into a hammock and to wake, clear-headed at the tap of a messmate's hand on the shoulder. And the hammock itself, that much maligned, slightly ridiculous canvas sling that sailors had been grumbling about for 300 years, turns out to be a small piece of accidental genius. Because when a ship rolls in a heavy sea, a bunk rolls with it, and your body has to brace against every pitch. A hammock, hung from 2 points, does the opposite. It stays roughly level while the ship moves around it. The sailor sways gently, cradled inside the chaos. He's being rocked, in the most literal and primordial sense, by the sea. And rocking as every mother of every baby in every century of human history has known, is the oldest sleeping pill there is. So here we are. It is spring 1940. Along the Franco-Belgian border, the British are still waiting, still trying to sleep in damp barns, still writing letters home. In the Maginot Line, the French are still drinking their linden tea. In Finland, the snow is starting to thaw over trenches that will never be used again, because the winter war has ended in March. The Germans have stockpiled their tank chocolate and memorized their Goethe. The Royal Navy is swinging quietly in its hammocks in the grey Atlantic. And then, on the 10th of May, everything breaks. Full gelb, case yellow. The German panzers come pouring through the Ardennes forest, a forest everyone has agreed, on very good authority, is impassable to tanks. And within 6 weeks, France has fallen. The British Expeditionary Force is standing in the water off Dunkirk, waiting for anything that floats, and the long, slow, shivering, phony war is over. From now on, no one in Europe will sleep the same way again. And for the next few months, it is the turn of a city to learn. London, in the summer of 1940, is a city holding its breath. The bombers have not yet come, but everyone knows they are coming. Blackout curtains have been hanging in every window since September of the previous year, turning the great glittering capital into a dark, silent map at night. The kind of darkness Londoners had not seen since the invention of the gas lamp. Anderson shelters have sprouted in back gardens like ugly corrugated toadstools. The children have mostly been evacuated, then mostly come home again because nothing seemed to be happening, which is an extremely British way of navigating a catastrophe. And then, on the 7th of September 1940, a sunny Saturday afternoon, with clouds like torn paper over the estuary, the sky fills with engines. Black Saturday. Nearly 1,000 German aircraft cross the Thames in neat formations that look, from a long distance, almost beautiful. They are heading for the docks. Within an hour, the East End is burning. Silvertown, Canning Town, Poplar, Rotherhithe, and the great Tate and Lyle sugar warehouses catch fire so fiercely that the flames burn golden, and the molten sugar runs in rivers along the cobblestones. And the Thames itself reflects a strange honeyed glow that people 100 miles away can see on the horizon. Londoners who were at their kitchen tables when it began describe, in mass observation diaries, stepping outside and thinking for just a second that the sun had set in the wrong direction. For the next 57 consecutive nights, London is bombed, every single night, without a break. The Germans do not know this at the time, but they are about to teach an entire civilian population how to sleep through the end of the world. And this is where the civilian sleep problem and the military sleep problem, which had been running on separate rails, suddenly fuse into one enormous tangled ball. Because the Home Guard are sleeping in the same shelters as the children. The ARP wardens are sleeping between patrols. The fire watchers are sleeping on rooftops. The anti-aircraft gunners are sleeping between barrages. The regular soldiers on leave are sleeping in their mothers' parlours with their boots on the hearth rug. Everyone is exhausted in exactly the same way, and everyone is trading tricks. Let us go underground for a while. By late September, the London Underground, which the government had initially refused to open as a shelter on the slightly touching grounds that people might enjoy it too much and never leave, has been taken over by the people themselves. 177,000 Londoners are sleeping down there every night at the peak. Aldwych, Bethnal Green. Elephant and Castle. Whole platforms given over to families, lined end to end with camp beds, deck chairs, bundled coats, chalk-marked squares of territory on the cold tile floor. There are thermos flasks. There are babies. There are occasionally small dogs smuggled in under shawls, despite official disapproval. The smell, and I am sorry to bring this up at bedtime, but it is part of the story, is difficult to convey unless you have stood in a warm enclosed space with 170,000 other humans. Unwashed bodies, carbolic disinfectant, slopped about generously by grim-faced LCC workers, boiled tea, bovril, pipe tobacco, a faint, sweetish trace of whatever had been for dinner in 100,000 kitchens upstairs. It is the smell of a city trying to survive, and for the people sleeping down there, it becomes, over weeks, the smell of home. The tube sleep tricks are lovely if you listen for them. Women knit. They knit, and they knit, and they knit, scarves and socks and balaclavas for sons overseas, and the clicking of their needles is, by their own admission, a meditation device disguised as productivity. The hands move, the mind empties, the eyelids droop, and eventually the knitting falls into the lap, and the woman sleeps sitting upright against the tiled wall. Men pull flat caps down over their eyes, the universal British gesture for I am no longer participating in anything. There is a quiet etiquette of shared blankets, the kind of etiquette that develops spontaneously wherever strangers must sleep near one another. You take a corner, you leave a corner, you do not hog, and on certain platforms at certain hours a regular hummer emerges. An elderly woman, usually with a voice like warm bath water, who hums old music hall tunes and hymns and lullabies, and the children on her stretch of platform fall asleep faster than anywhere else. No one pays her, she simply does it. There is one, at Elephant and Castle, whom mass observation diarists record by her first name, Ethel, and whom mothers specifically carried their babies to, across 3 platforms, to be hummed to sleep. Mass observation, if you have not met them, are one of the great gifts of wartime Britain. An amateur anthropological project founded in 1937 by Tom Harrison and his colleagues, dedicated to the revolutionary idea that ordinary British people might be worth studying. Their diarists, housewives, clerks, schoolteachers, the wonderful Nella Last in Barrow in Furness filling notebook after notebook, record every small sleep trick they encounter. How to make earplugs out of candle wax softened between the fingers, then pressed into a ball with a wisp of cotton wool and shaped to the ear canal. This becomes, in 1940, an entire small economy. Women swap recipes for the perfect wax plug the way they used to swap recipes for jam. Too much cotton, and it falls out. Too little, and the wax sticks. The sweet spot, apparently, is roughly a pea-sized lump, warmed in the palm for exactly as long as it takes to sing the first verse of Roses of Picardy. I am not making that up. Someone wrote it down. Meanwhile, above ground, the anti-aircraft guns are beginning to answer back. Anti-Aircraft Command, under General Sir Frederick Pyle, known to absolutely everyone as Tim Pyle, is one of the unsung miracles of the Blitz. Pyle's gunners, young men, and, from 1941 onwards, young women, have to be ready to fire at any minute through the long night, which means they have to sleep in patches between barrages, sometimes between individual shells. Pyle, a clever and deeply humane commander, works out a 10-minute cot rotation system at his batteries in Primrose Hill and Hyde Park. A gunner comes off his gun, lies down on a cot, closes his eyes for 10 minutes, and is then shaken awake and sent back. The idea sounds absurd, but it works. 10 minutes of genuine sleep, repeated enough times, keeps a human being more or less functional for the 16-hour stretch of a heavy night raid. To make those 10 minutes count, Pyle teaches his gunners what becomes known, affectionately, as Pyle's cat nap. You lie down in full kit, boots on, webbing on, helmet beside the cot within finger's reach. You place one forearm across your eyes, not because you are weeping, though some of them are, but because the searchlight flashes sweeping the sky outside will strobe through any crack in the blackout and shred your sleep into ribbons. Your arm is your personal blackout curtain. You breathe slowly. You do not think about what you are going to do next. You think, if you think of anything, about something green and peaceful, a cricket ground, a pub garden, a seaside, and within about a minute, you are gone. This is, by the way, almost exactly the same technique the US Navy will formalize 2 years later in its pre-flight school manual, and which will become, 70 years later, the thing you see in every YouTube short titled, "Fall asleep in 90 seconds, this really works." It does really work. It worked in Primrose Hill in 1940 under falling bombs with men who had not had a full night's sleep in 2 months. It will almost certainly work for you in your bed tonight. The Auxiliary Territorial Service women from 1941 onwards are posted to the mixed batteries, working the predictors, the rangefinders, the searchlights, all the intricate mathematical machinery of shooting at something you cannot see. And they bring their own tricks. Hair in rag curlers at night, because the steel rim of a tin helmet digs into a hairstyle something fierce. And a well-rolled rag curl provides a surprising amount of padding. A sprig of lavender from a mother's garden, or a grandmother's garden, tucked into the pillowcase of a camp bunk in a Nissen hut outside London. Lavender, which has been recommended for sleep since at least the Roman physicians, and which the ATS girls rediscover by pure instinct in the year they are first allowed to shoot at aeroplanes. Higher up, on the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral, the fire watchers are working a different discipline entirely. Among them, on certain nights, is the novelist Rose Macaulay, 59 years old, thin as a rake, wearing an air raid precautions tin hat over her grey hair. The St. Paul's Watch is a volunteer corps of writers, architects and clergymen tasked with saving the cathedral from incendiaries, and they sleep up there in short bursts, feet braced against the lead guttering to stop them rolling off the roof in their sleep, 20 minutes at a time. Rose Macaulay reportedly slept best of all of them, wrapped in a greatcoat, because, as she wrote to a friend, she had been sleeping in inconvenient places her entire life, and the cathedral roof was merely the latest one. Across the channel, the other side of this nightmare is being lived in mirror image. At Luftwaffe air bases in occupied France, Beauvais, Saint-André, Amiens, bomber crews return in the grey small hours, adrenaline still humming in their fingertips, unable to sleep because they know they will fly again in 12 hours. The Luftwaffe flight surgeons, grappling with exactly the same problem the RAF is grappling with on the other side of the water, come up with their own protocol. A hot shower first, then a shot of schnapps to widen the blood vessels, then a specific pine needle bath additive called Fichtenadel, sold commercially before the war as a cold remedy, which steams aromatically in the barracks bathroom and carries, like the Finnish spruce boughs, those same gentle tree oils into the lungs. Then, Fliegerschokolade, another pervitin derivative, because the Germans never met a stimulant they did not want to weaponize, for the outbound flight the next day, and for tonight, to force sleep, a little pill called B-tabletten, a barbiturate, reliable, dangerous, increasingly addictive. The squadron doctor hands them out like sweets. Back in London, the bombs continue. And domestic British ingenuity, never to be underestimated, responds with one of the genuinely lovely inventions of the war. The Morrison shelter, introduced in 1941 and named after Home Secretary Herbert Morrison, is essentially a steel cage table, a thing you could eat your dinner on during the day and climb into as a family at night. 4 people, stacked like small loaves of bread, sleeping on a mattress inside a wire mesh box in the middle of their own living room. It sounds grim. It actually looks grim. And yet the diaries are surprisingly warm about it, because what happens in house after house is this. Dad, on the outside edge, tells a story through the mesh. Mum, on the inside edge, hums along. The children, between them, fall asleep to a voice they have known since birth, inside a cage, in a city being bombed. This becomes known in a few diaries and one beautiful letter I have never forgotten as the Morrison Lullaby. And then, in May of 1941, without anyone at the time quite realizing it, the Blitz stops. Hitler has turned his eyes east toward the Soviet Union, and the Luftwaffe bombers are being redeployed for Operation Barbarossa. The raids taper, the sirens fall silent, and Londoners, who have spent 8 months teaching their nervous systems to sleep through explosions, discover something unexpected and almost funny. They cannot sleep in the silence. Mothers lie awake listening for the all-clear that does not come, because there is no raid to be all-clear from. Children wake at 3 in the morning asking where the bombs are. Fire watchers, pulled off the roofs, toss and turn in their own beds, missing the cold wind and the lead guttering against their boots. A whole city has been retuned to a new frequency, and the return to peace, when it comes in fragments, is itself a small sleep disorder. It takes weeks. In some cases, it takes years. And some of those Londoners will tell you, if you ask them gently in their old age, that they never quite slept the same again. The human nervous system, it turns out, is stubborn in both directions. It learns to sleep through anything. And then, having learned, it does not entirely want to unlearn. The silence was the strangest bomb of all, which brings us, almost inevitably, eastward. Because while London was learning to sleep without bombs, an entire continent of men was learning to sleep with them, and in conditions that made the underground platform look, in retrospect, rather like a spa. On the 22nd of June, 1941, at just past 3 in the morning, the German army crossed the Soviet frontier along a line stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and Operation Barbarossa began. 3 million men. 600,000 horses, the largest invasion force in human history. And from that moment until the final collapse of the Reich 4 years later, somewhere between 6 and 9 million men were sleeping on any given night in holes in the ground on the Eastern Front. Let us climb into one of those holes with them. You are a Lancer, a German infantryman in the winter of 1941. You are sitting in a scrape hollowed out of the Russian earth, somewhere west of Moscow, and the temperature, according to the field weather reports for December of that year, is hovering around -30 degrees Celsius. In the worst weeks of that winter, and the winter that follows, it will drop to -40. At -40, by the way, Celsius and Fahrenheit meet at the same point, which is a fact you learn very quickly when your eyelashes freeze together every time you blink. You have not been issued winter clothing. Nobody expected to still be fighting in December. The Führer had promised a summer campaign. Your greatcoat is the wrong weight. Your boots are the wrong shape. You have frostbite in 2 toes, and you will lose them in January. So you improvise. You pull on a second greatcoat, stripped from a dead comrade or stolen from a supply dump, and you wear them both at once. The inner one backwards, so the buttons do not dig into your spine. You stuff newspaper between your shirt and your skin. German newspaper, Russian newspaper, any paper at all, because paper traps a thin layer of air, and air is warmth. You learn this trick from Russian peasants whose villages you have occupied, and who have been surviving these winters for 1,000 years, and are mildly amused by the invaders' surprise that it is cold. You stuff your boots with straw. You scrape a shallow trough beneath your body, so that when you curl into it, the heat you radiate is cupped by the earth rather than carried off by the wind. And then, if you are very lucky, you sleep. Across no man's land, a Red Army soldier is sleeping better than you. Not because he is tougher, though he may be, but because he has been dressed for this weather since birth. He has valenki, traditional felt boots, knee-high, nearly weightless, warm as a loaf of bread straight from the oven. He has an ushanka, the fur-flap hat, pulled down over his face, with only a small slit for the nose, so that his own breath, trapped inside, warms the air entering his lungs. And when he sleeps back to back with another soldier under a single shared greatcoat, a practice so common it has a phrase of its own, spat vdvoyum, to sleep two together. It is not romantic, it is thermodynamic. 2 bodies beneath one coat retain something like 4 times the heat of one body beneath one coat. There is an entire field of physiology in that sentence, and a Soviet rifleman worked it out by being cold. In the dugouts at Stalingrad over the terrible winter of 1942 into 1943, the political officers, the Zampolits whom history has not always been kind to, take on an unexpected role. At lights out, in the flickering glow of an oil lamp, they read aloud Pushkin, Lermontov, and most often Tolstoy. Long, slow passages from War and Peace, because there is a certain grim humour in reading War and Peace to men who are currently the subject of a future chapter. And the men fall asleep to the rhythm of Russian prose in a voice that, for a few minutes, is not shouting at them. You could, if you wanted, call this the first audiobook sleep app. It was free. But the Eastern Front is not the only mud in this war, and we must move south because the Italian campaign is doing its own particular damage to the human nervous system. In July of 1943, the Allies land in Sicily, Operation Husky, and begin the slow, bitter walk up the Italian peninsula that will occupy them for the next 2 years. Salerno, the Volturno, the Gustav Line, Monte Cassino, and in January of 1944, the landings at Anzio, where a British and American force lands 30 miles behind the German line, and then, inexplicably, digs in rather than advancing, and finds itself pinned on the beachhead for 4 months under constant shell fire. The foxholes at Anzio are cut into volcanic tufa, which drains water about as well as a teacup drains soup. Every hole fills with rain. Every rain is cold. Every night is a contest between sleep and hypothermia. And the knowledge that a shell from the German battery nicknamed Anzio Annie, a railway gun the size of a small building, might, at any moment, rearrange your geography. The men live in these holes for weeks. The cold damp rising through the blankets is the specific cold. Generations of soldiers have told us that wears a body down faster than any other. It is the cold that produces trench foot. It is the cold that makes sleep itself feel unsafe. And it is in these holes that the American infantryman refines the great sleep innovation of the Second World War, the two-man watch. It is not new. The British had it. The Romans probably had it. But it is formalized in 1943 in U.S. Army Field Manual 21-75, which tells every GI in plain language that in a two-man foxhole, one man sleeps and one man watches, and you swap every 2 hours, and you do not fudge it. The rhythm of the two-man watch is the rhythm of sleep for 3 million Americans for the rest of the war. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Shake your body. Lie down. Close your eyes. Try. The trouble, of course, is that 2 hours is not really sleep. 2 hours is a tease. And so the United States Army, rather wonderfully, goes and studies the problem. Major William Darby, who commands the Rangers and is one of the more interesting and less celebrated figures of the war, pushes his instructors at the Ranger Training School to teach a thing called the combat nap. You sit with your back against a tree or a wall or a Jeep tire. You cross your legs to stabilize the core. You tip your helmet forward over your eyes. You breathe in for 4, you hold for 7, you breathe out for 8. That breathing pattern, by the way, the 4, the 7, the 8, is not new either. The paratroopers are already using a version of it, taught to them in jump school to steady the pulse before a night drop. It will be reintroduced to the civilian world in the 1990s by a holistic physician named Andrew Weil, who will popularize it as the 4-7-8 breath. He is absolutely right that it works. What the internet sometimes forgets is that it was first worked out by frightened young men trying not to throw up before they jumped out of a SAIC 47 into the dark. 7 minutes of a Ranger's combat nap, according to the instructors, is worth 40 minutes of poor sleep in a bed. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, but not by as much as you might think. Ernie Pyle, the greatest war correspondent of the century, the one who wrote as if he were telling you something over a kitchen table, files dispatches from Italy in which he describes infantrymen sleeping while walking. Columns of them, marching at dusk up a mountain track, each man leaning gently into the pack of the man in front of him, eyes closed, feet still moving. He writes about it almost tenderly. The mind, Pyle says, will find a way. When the body has walked enough, the mind will simply hand over control to the spinal cord and excuse itself for a nap. To muffle the world enough to sleep in a foxhole, the GI develops 1,000 small tricks. He pulls the flaps of his wool cap down tight over his ears. The mule ear, it is called, which deadens incoming shells just enough to drop the cortisol by a quarter, which is sometimes the difference between sleeping and not. He keeps a photograph inside his helmet liner and kisses it 3 times before lying down. And he would be embarrassed if you mentioned it, but he would not stop. He has a lucky pebble from Omaha Beach or from the first farm he cleared in Normandy, and it travels in his trouser pocket all the way to Nuremberg. Some of those pebbles are in grandchildren's jewellery boxes today. A few are in museums. Most simply disappeared, the way lucky things do once their job was done. The British 8th Army, meanwhile, has its own sleep medicine, and it comes out of a tin. Char and a wad. Sweet, milky tea and a biscuit taken at any opportunity, and certainly before sleep. It looks trivial. It is not. Hot, sweet tea before bed does two things at once. It warms the core, which encourages the peripheral blood vessels to dilate and shed heat, which is the precise physiological cue the brain uses to begin sleep. And the sugar stabilizes blood glucose across the long, hollow night, so that you do not wake up at 2 in the morning shivering and starving. A Tommy sipping his char at 1900 hours in a ditch near Casino is accidentally doing something a nutritionist might recommend to an anxious insomniac in London 80 years later. He would find that funny. The superstitions multiply. You do not whistle in a dugout. You do not share a match with 2 other men. You wrap your rosary around your wrist before sleep, so that if the shell comes, your hands will be holding the beads, and that will count for something. The Catholic GI from Boston and the Methodist from Alabama develop, over months, an oddly similar sleep theology. Small objects, small gestures, small prayers, a grammar of the bedtime ritual that the chaplains quietly encourage because they know, perhaps better than the generals do, that faith and sleep are close cousins and both of them relax the shoulders. Around this time, too, 2 American combat psychiatrists named Roy Swank and Walter Marchand are doing the quiet, ugly, necessary work of following infantrymen through long campaigns and measuring what happens to them. Their 1946 paper, summarizing work done from 1944 onward, proposes what will later be called the 200-day rule. At roughly 200 days of continuous frontline combat, they conclude, a soldier's sleep architecture collapses. Not his morale, not his courage, his sleep. He can no longer enter deep sleep. He wakes every 40 minutes. He dreams, when he dreams at all, in fragments. And from there, everything else in him begins to go. It is one of the first and still one of the clearest pieces of evidence that sleep is not a consequence of survival, but a precondition of it. You cannot outbrave a broken sleep cycle. No one can. On the German side, the Lancer is developing his own small domestic rituals in his own small hole. He whittles a piece of wood, a spoon, a chess piece, a crude little horse for the child he has not seen in 2 years, and he whittles until his hands are tired and his eyes are heavy and the wood shaving smells faintly of pine, and then he lies back. The shared cigarette passes from hand to hand in the dugout. 3 men, 1 kipper, and the ritual of passing it quiets the nervous system the way ritual always does. And then someone, quietly, begins to hum Lily Marlene. Not the propaganda version, the slow, longing version, the one that originally got Layla Anderson in trouble with Goebbels for being too sad. By the end of the war, both sides are humming it. Both sides are falling asleep to the same tune in opposing trenches, and nobody quite knows what to do with that fact. And then comes the 6th of June, 1944. You are 20 years old. You are from Iowa or from Dublin or from Manitoba. You jumped out of an aeroplane into the dark about 6 hours ago. You landed, somehow, not in the field you were supposed to land in, but in a hedgerow 2 miles from anything. You have spent the pre-dawn hours finding 1 other paratrooper, then 2, then 5, and you have fought a short, ugly skirmish at a crossroads. And now, just after dawn, you are lying in the wet grass with your back against the root ball of a hawthorn and your rifle across your chest, and you are being told to rest for an hour. An hour to sleep on D-Day in Normandy, with the largest invasion in history happening in a roar on the beaches 4 miles to the north. Some of them do it, some of them cannot. And the ones who cannot reach into the breast pocket of their jump smock and take out a small brass and steel toy, a child's clicker shaped like a cricket, designation ANH-1, issued by the Army as a recognition signal, 1 click answered by 2. They press it against their chest, feeling the faint tick of the spring, and they breathe to the rhythm of it. Click, breathe, click, breathe. A tiny metal heartbeat from a toy factory in New Jersey, pressed to the sternum of a frightened boy in a Norman hedge, slowing him down, until somehow, astonishingly, he is asleep in the French grass with the largest battle of the 20th century unfolding over the horizon. It is one of the most human things anyone has ever done, and it will not be the last trick we meet tonight. Which brings us, as the grey light of that Norman morning spreads over the hedgerows, to the men who had delivered those paratroopers through the dark, and to every other young man in a flying jacket on every runway from Lincolnshire to the Solomon Islands. Because if the infantryman's war on sleep was fought in mud, the airman's was fought in a different element altogether. It was fought in adrenaline. It was fought in pharmacology. It was fought in the strange compressed whiplash of sitting down to a plate of bacon and eggs at breakfast, being 200 miles over enemy territory by dinner, and trying to sleep at midnight in the bunk of a friend who would not be coming back. Let us go back 4 years to the summer of 1940 and to a wicker chair in a patch of grass beside a Spitfire at RAF Biggin Hill. The pilot is 19. He is wearing a sheepskin Irvine jacket against the morning chill, though by midday it will be flung across the back of the chair. He has a thermos of cocoa on the grass beside him. The squadron dog, a mongrel of unknown but confident heritage, is asleep on his feet. He has already flown once this morning, a dawn patrol over the channel that brought him back shaking so badly he could not light his own cigarette, and he will fly again in 40 minutes, and again an hour after that, and possibly a 5th time before dusk. Between each scramble, he has perhaps 30 minutes. If he cannot sleep in those 30 minutes, he will be slower next time. If he is slower next time, he will die. The arithmetic really is that clean. So he learns. Fighter Command learns. The whole of the Battle of Britain learns together in the summer of 1940 a thing they call dispersal sleep. You lean back in the wicker chair. You close your eyes. You start at the top of your face and you let the muscles go. The forehead, then the eyes, then the jaw, which is where most of us quietly hold the whole of the day. Then the shoulders, then the hands in the lap. You do not try to sleep. Trying is the enemy. You simply undo, piece by piece, the tension that has been holding you together. And at some point, usually, if you are good at it, inside 90 seconds, you are not awake anymore. That technique does not vanish in 1945. It gets written down. In 1942, the United States Navy Pre-Flight School produces a training manual that codifies a very similar drill for naval aviators. And then, decades later, in 1981, a track coach named Lloyd Winter writes a book called Relax and Win. And in it, he describes, as if discovering something fresh, a military method for falling asleep in 2 minutes. It is the dispersal chair method. It is the wicker chair method. It has simply been handed down quietly from a 19-year-old at Biggin Hill with a dog on his feet to you tonight on your phone, reading listicles about how to fall asleep faster. You are welcome. By late 1942, the war in the air has shifted shape. Bomber Command, under the famously implacable Sir Arthur Harris, is running a night offensive over Germany that will last, with terrible consistency, until the spring of 1945. And the sleep schedule it imposes on its crews is, quite simply, an attack on human biology. Picture the day in reverse. Briefing at 1800 hours. Takeoff at 2200. 7 or 8 hours in the freezing fuselage of a Lancaster or a Halifax over the Ruhr, over Hamburg, over Berlin, watching other bombers burn and fall on either side of you. Back over the North Sea in the small hours. Land at around 4 in the morning, shaking, deaf from the engines, the sweat dried into frost inside the flying suit. Debrief until 6. Breakfast at 6:30. And it is always bacon and eggs, because the RAF has worked out, with a kind of administrative tenderness, that bacon and eggs is the surest food to stay down in an exhausted stomach. Then bed, in a blacked-out Nissen hut, while the rest of the base wakes into a perfectly ordinary English morning around you. Postman walking past, cows complaining, sunlight trying to find its way through the blackout curtains, and you expected to sleep. You cannot, of course, not without help. And so, from the middle of 1942, the squadron medical officer starts issuing help. The famous wakey-wakey tablets, benzodrine sulfate, 2 to a packet, 1 for the outbound leg, and 1 to hold you together on the way home. And then, at the other end, the sleepers. Barbiturates, usually a mild sodium amytal, issued by the MO, like communion wafers to men who could not otherwise switch off. Up with 1 pill, down with another. Repeat, if you lived 30 times, which was the length of a bomber tour. The RAF was, in one sense, running the largest uncontrolled pharmacological experiment on young men in the history of medicine. And the psychological bill for that experiment would come due long after the war was over. There were superstitions too, and they were the stubborn, quiet kind. You did not change the bedding between sorties. The sheets stayed as they were, with the shape of you still in them, because to change them felt like admitting that you might not be coming back to use them. You did not sit on another man's bunk if he was still flying. You did not mention anyone by name after they had failed to return. You simply folded their kit and left it, and eventually, at some quiet and unremarkable hour, the ground crew took it away. Across the base, the Americans arrived. From 1942, the 8th Air Force began to fill the airfields of East Anglia with B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, and with them came a new phrase, maximum effort. That meant everything you had, every bomber, every crew in the air on the same day. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Ploesti. The Americans chose, for reasons of doctrine and pride, to fly by day, which made them more accurate and very much easier to shoot down. Loss rates in the autumn of 1943 were, in certain weeks, above 10% per mission. 25 missions was a tour. You do not need a calculator for that arithmetic either. The sleep problem on an American bomber base was different in texture from the British one. The Americans came home in daylight and they came home into a base full of empty bunks, and they had to try to sleep in the early evening, which the body stubbornly does not want to do. The flight surgeons of the 8th Air Force developed an almost maternal set of orders for the post-mission hour. A hot shower, a glass of milk, genuinely prescribed, because the tryptophan and the ritual both helped. A pulp novel from the base library, because nothing quieted an overstimulated mind like a bad detective story. And, above all, no talking about the mission. Not yet. Not in the hut. Save that for tomorrow, in daylight, when the shape of the thing had settled a little. In 1943, a USAAF colonel named Ross McFarland began a series of studies that were, in their quiet way, foundational. He measured pilots' alertness after 4 hours of sleep, after 6, after 8. He measured their reaction times, their errors, their judgment. The numbers he produced are the ancestors of every modern paper on circadian rhythm and pilot fatigue. The rules about how many hours a commercial airline captain may fly today, the mandatory rest periods, the jet lag protocols used by NASA, all of them descend in a more or less straight line from a colonel with a stopwatch on an East Anglian airfield, trying to work out why good men were crashing perfectly good aeroplanes on approach. On the other side of the line, in the Netherlands, the Luftwaffe was running its own nightly war. Colonel Heijo Hermann had proposed, in 1943, a tactic called wilde Sau, wild boar, in which single-seat fighters would hunt bombers over burning German cities, using the fires below as silhouettes. It was gallant and horrifying and desperate, and the men who flew it slept in leather armchairs in dispersal huts at Venlo and Leeuwarden, in flight kit, waiting for the phone. They were kept awake, as the British and Americans were, on methamphetamine. Pervitin, the same Panzerchokolade that had driven the Blitzkrieg. They were brought down at the end of the night on codeine, or sometimes on morphine, which does to the human brain exactly what you would imagine it does. The Luftwaffe had one small, beautifully sensible innovation, and it is worth mentioning because it is something you can actually buy on the internet tonight. They issued their day-sleeping crews blackout goggles, Schlafbrille, heavy black leather cups lined with felt that sealed around the eye sockets and left the pilot in absolute darkness at noon. Every sleep mask sold at every airport duty-free is a grandchild of the Schlafbrille. The Germans did not invent the idea, but they did build a very good one. Halfway around the world, at Rabaul, and on the rolling decks of the carriers that would meet at Midway, a completely different sleep culture was unfolding. The Japanese naval aviator trained his sleep the way he trained his sword work, as a discipline, not a comfort. Before a mission, he bowed briefly to the small photograph of his family pinned inside his locker. He faced east. He took 3 deep breaths deliberately from the belly, and he drank a single small cup of green tea, accompanied by 1 salted umeboshi plum, whose sharp sour taste was believed to settle the stomach and clear the head. At meals, he practiced hara hachibu, eat until you are 80% full, which, it turns out, is one of the most reliable pieces of sleep advice ever written down. A stomach that is 80% full will let you sleep. A stomach that is 100% full will not. Your grandmother told you this. The Imperial Japanese Navy told its pilots this. They were both right. From October 1944 onwards, the Japanese naval sleep tradition took on a final, almost unbearable form, when the Toko, the special attack units, the kamikaze, were formed. The night before a mission, the pilots were offered a cup of sake, sometimes laced with a mild sedative to help them rest. They wrote death poems, jisei, in the old form. One line, one image, one acknowledgement that the self was about to dissolve. They sang, together, the old naval song Umi Yukaba, which translates very approximately, as if I go to the sea, my body will be washed by water. If I go to the mountain, my body will be covered by moss. And then, most of them somehow slept. How they slept is a question that does not have an easy answer. Some of them did not. Some of them wrote letters through the night. Some of them, according to the accounts of ground crew and base chaplains, slept extraordinarily deeply, as if, having made the decision, they had also made peace with the nervous system. It is not for us, 80 years later, to say what they felt. It is only for us to note that the human capacity to sleep in the shadow of death is older and stranger than any of us remember when we are lying awake worrying about an email. Across all of these air forces, across all of these bases, English, German, American, Japanese, a strange truth settled on the airmen that the infantry, for all its suffering, did not quite share. The airmen understood, in a way you cannot understand if you have not done it, that sleep and death share a doorway. You close your eyes. You let go of the wheel. You surrender consciousness. In a bed, you come back. In a plane, sometimes you do not. And so the rituals around sleep for airmen on every side took on the shape of small, careful negotiations with that doorway. The photograph, the plum, the pulp novel, the wicker chair, the blackout goggles, the squadron dog on the feet, the glass of milk, the song. You will notice that almost none of these are pharmacological. The benzodrine and the barbiturates are in there, of course, and they did real damage to real men. And the long post-war story of alcoholism and insomnia among RAF and USAAF veterans is not a cheerful one. But the tricks that actually worked, the ones that did not leave a hangover, the ones the pilots remembered fondly 40 years later at reunion dinners, those were always the small sensory ones. Warmth, routine, a particular food, a particular sound, a particular weight on the feet, which is why, if you have a cat or a small dog or a heavy blanket at the bottom of your bed right now, you are, in a very literal sense, doing what a Spitfire pilot did in 1940. They did not know they were doing science. They thought they were just trying to get through the week. But they were, in fact, assembling, out of folklore and flight surgeon folklore and sheer exhausted improvisation, a library of sleep techniques that would outlast every aircraft they flew. The Lancaster is in a museum. The Messerschmitt is in a museum. The Zero, what is left of it, is mostly under coral. But the 90-second dispersal nap is in your phone, right now, as an article titled "The Military Sleep Method That Changes Everything." And it does change things. It is just that the person who first changed them was a teenager in a wicker chair with a dog on his feet, trying not to think about the next scramble. Which brings us finally to the sea. Because the airmen, for all their strangeness, at least slept on dry land. The men we are going to meet next slept inside a steel tube, 6 inches from a diesel engine, under 200 feet of cold black water, in a mattress still warm from the body of the man who had just crawled out of it. His name, if we must pick one, is Abel Seaman, and he is 19 years old, and he has not been properly dry in 6 weeks. He is aboard the corvette HMS Bluebell, somewhere in the middle grey of the North Atlantic, in the winter of 1941, and the wind outside is a steady force 9, which means the sea is a wall that keeps arriving, and the ship is a small iron thing that keeps being hit by it. The corvettes were built originally as whalers. They were not built for the North Atlantic. They were built for fishing off the Norwegian coast in summer. Somebody in the Admiralty, in a hurry, had looked at the drawings and said, "Yes, that will do," and ordered 140 of them. And now 19-year-olds from Glasgow and Belfast and Hull were trying to sleep inside them, while the ocean tried to turn them inside out. The Battle of the Atlantic ran from 1940 until 1943, and in the official histories it is fought with charts and convoy codes and wolf-pack tactics and the work of the code breakers at Bletchley. In the lived memory of the men who fought it, it was a battle about sleep. You could not properly sleep on a corvette. The mess deck, where most of the crew hung their hammocks, was directly above the engine room, so the bulkhead was always warm and always loud. The hammocks themselves were slung so close that if the man next to you rolled, you rolled. Men slept on the mess tables, on the benches, on folded oilskins in the passageway. In the drying room, among wet uniforms that steamed in the low amber light, anywhere the motion of the ship was a little less violent than where they had been the hour before. And at the heart of it, holding the whole arrangement together, was the tot, the daily rum ration of the Royal Navy, 8 fluid ounces of pusses at 11:15 in the morning, mixed 3 parts water to 1 part rum for the ordinary seaman, neat for the senior ratings, is one of those institutions the Admiralty kept going long after it stopped making any tactical sense. They did not finally abolish it until 1970, on what is still remembered in some quarters as Black Tot Day. During the war, no one thought to abolish it. During the war, the tot was not really about alcohol. It was about a pause, a ritual, a warm, sweet burn in the chest halfway through a watch. And for very many sailors, it was also, whether the Admiralty admitted it or not, the sleeping pill that got them through the next night. You do not recommend this as a sleep strategy. You do note that an awful lot of the men who won that war credited it. The merchant seamen of the Arctic convoys had it worse. PQ-17 in the summer of 1942 and PQ-18 that autumn sailed from Iceland to Murmansk through water cold enough to kill a man in 3 minutes, with German U-boats below and the Luftwaffe above, and the men on the freighters slept, when they slept at all, in their cork life jackets. You had to. You could not afford, if the torpedo came, the 30 seconds it would take to put one on. So you slept inside it. And cork, for all its virtues, is not soft. Arctic convoy veterans, for decades afterwards, had permanent bruises on their collarbones, small dark oval shadows where the jacket had pressed against the bone, night after night, through every hour of every crossing. A body remembers what it has been asked to do. On the destroyers which ran ahead of the convoys hunting submarines, the captain did not really sleep. He could not. An attack could come at any minute, and decisions were measured in seconds, and so destroyer captains developed what the Royal Navy, in its fondness for quiet phrases, called the lanyard sleep. The captain rigged a small cot or a leather-covered bench on the bridge itself, under the wing, wrapped in oilskins, and he lay down in full uniform, and he tied a length of light cord around his wrist. The other end went to the officer of the watch. If anything at all changed, a report, a shape on the horizon, an unfamiliar engine note. A single tug on the cord would bring him awake in the time it took to open his eyes. Some captains wore that lanyard for weeks on end. Some of them, by the end of a patrol, could no longer sleep without it. There are men who, 30 years after the war, reported that they still could not fall asleep unless something, anything, was looped around their wrist. Now, lower the camera. Lower it further. Down below the grey rolling surface, down to 200 feet, into a steel cylinder about the width of a London bus, painted a particular shade of German grey-green, smelling of diesel and sweat and wet leather, and, very faintly, of lemons. Welcome aboard a Type 7 Sea U-boat. There were 50 men in that boat. There were 26 bunks. The arithmetic is unforgiving. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who ran the U-boat fleet from a set of requisitioned villas in western France, ran it lean, and he ran it tight. And one of the consequences of running it lean was that every boat sailed with more men than it had berths for. The solution was heiße Koje, the hot bunk, or more literally, the hot berth. And the practice was simple, practical, and just a little bit horrible. 3 men shared 2 bunks in rotation. You came off watch, you crawled into a mattress that was still warm from the man who had just left it. You closed your eyes on a pillow that smelled of his hair oil and his diesel and his fear, and you slept, if you could, for 4 hours, until the next man woke you up and the whole thing ran again in the other direction. U-boat crews did not, after a while, particularly notice the smell. That is, in itself, a small horror. The rules inside a submarine at rest were strict and very nearly sacred. Tiefschlaf, deep sleep, was the period when the off-watch crew was officially asleep, and the rest of the boat was expected to move around them like ghosts. Lights were dimmed, conversations dropped to whispers, tools were passed, not laid down. The engineer on watch, if he needed to walk the length of the pressure hull, took his boots off and did it in socks. And some commanders, the good ones, the ones whose crews loved them, went further. Otto Kretschmer, the highest-scoring U-boat ace of the war, until the British fished him out of the sea in March 1941 and put him in a prison camp for the duration, insisted on classical music at rest hours. He had a wind-up gramophone in the control room. He had a small, carefully preserved collection of records. And the thing he played most often, his crews remembered afterwards, was Bach, the cello suites, the unaccompanied ones, that slow, patient conversation between a single instrument and its own echo. 50 exhausted young men slept to Bach 200 feet under the North Atlantic, because their captain had decided that was the kind of sound a human nervous system could rest to. He was right. It is still right. The humidity inside a U-boat on a long patrol was, to use the technical term, appalling. Condensation dripped from the overhead pipes onto sleeping faces. Bread grew mold you could watch spread. Lemons, issued against scurvy, had to be rationed carefully. And the smell, which had started out as diesel and sweat, eventually became something richer and more complicated, to the point that the crews were issued a cologne, a cheap German brand called Colibri, and encouraged politely to use it. Every boat in the fleet smelled, underneath everything else, faintly of Colibri. Returning crews were recognizable on the dockside by the smell alone. Across the world, under Admiral Charles Lockwood at Pearl Harbor and at Fremantle in Western Australia, the United States Pacific submarine fleet was fighting a quieter and, in the end, more devastating war against Japanese shipping. The USS Tang, the USS Wahoo, boats whose names still mean something to people who know, ran patrols that could last 60, 70, 80 days. And the Americans, being Americans, threw money and engineering at the sleep problem. From 1942 onwards, the new fleet boats were air-conditioned. You need to let that sentence land. In 1942, ordinary American households did not have air conditioning. American cinemas had it, American department stores had it, and American submarines had it. Because Admiral Lockwood had looked at the loss rate and the exhaustion rate and decided that a crew that could sleep in a cool, dry bunk would fight a better boat than a crew that could not. He was right. Morale on the Pacific boats, by every measure the Navy could invent, was noticeably higher than on comparable boats in any other fleet. And then there was the light. Somebody, at some point in 1942, in a room full of engineers at the Bureau of Ships, worked out something that modern sleep science has spent the last 20 years rediscovering. If you keep a submarine lit in ordinary white light all day and all night, the crew's circadian rhythm goes to pieces. But red light, very low red light, the colour of a coal fire at the last embers, does not. It preserves night vision when you have to come up to periscope depth in darkness. Yes, but it also, almost as a happy accident, preserves the body's sense of when it is night. They called it rigging for red. At sunset, inside the boat, the lighting shifted. Every bulb went red. The boat became a dim, warm cavern, and the men who were off watch found themselves, without quite understanding why, getting sleepy at the right time. Every red sleep bulb you have ever bought, every amber setting on every phone, every night shift option in every operating system, every little lamp sold on the internet promising to help you wind down. All of it is the great-grandchild of a submariner's panel light. The idea was there. It simply took us 80 years to put it in the bedroom. After each patrol, the Silent Service sent its crews to the Royal Hawaiian Hotel on Waikiki Beach for 2 weeks of mandated rest. That is not a euphemism. The United States Navy requisitioned a pink palace on the Pacific and filled it with exhausted submariners and told them firmly that they were to sleep, eat fresh fruit, lie on the sand, and be massaged by trained professionals for 2 weeks before they went back out. It was, very probably, the most civilized thing any navy has ever done to its own men. On the Japanese side, in the big ocean-going I-boats that prowled from Truk and Rabaul, the tradition was quieter. Many crewmen carried an omamori, a small silk charm from a shrine back home, and they slept with it tucked under the thin pillow, or pinned inside the rolled coat that served as one. It was not a pharmacological solution. It was a small contract with the universe, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had walked up a hill to a shrine on your behalf and was expecting you back. And there were the ships you do not usually think about when you think about sea power. The hospital ships, HMHS Arbor, USS Solace, great white hulls with enormous red crosses painted on them, legally neutral, lit at night when everyone else was blacked out. Inside those ships, in long rows of beds that rocked with the swell, wounded men slept to the sound of women singing. The VADs, the Voluntary Aid Detachment nurses, and the US Navy corpsmen, and the Queen Alexandra sisters moved through the wards at lights out and sang softly the lullabies they had learned from their own mothers. All through the night, Danny Boy, Brahms, a boy from Nebraska with his leg gone from the knee down, drifting off in the South Pacific, to the sound of a Welsh nurse singing a song her grandmother had sung her in Carmarthen. That is a thing that happened many thousands of times in the quiet hours, and is not in the official histories because nobody thought to put it there. On the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, the most decorated American warship of the war, off-duty pilots sometimes slung hammocks down on the hangar deck between the folded wings of parked Hellcats, because the steel there was cooler than in the bunk rooms, and the vibration of the ship was a steadier, slower hum. They slept surrounded by the aircraft they would fly in the morning. Photographs of this exist. They are among the strangest and most beautiful images of the war. And pull back now from all of this, from the corvettes and the U-boats and the fleet submarines and the hospital ships, and notice one thing. The sea itself rocks you. It has done so since before there were people to be rocked. The motion of a ship at sea, the long, slow pendulum of a hull in a moderate swell, is very close to the motion of a cradle. Every parent who has ever walked a crying baby in slow arcs across a dark bedroom has been practicing, without knowing it, a piece of technology as old as life. And the weighted blankets that sleep shops now sell for $200 with marketing copy about deep pressure stimulation, those descend, in a very real sense, from the heavy wool greatcoat a sailor pulled over himself in a swinging hammock on a January night in 1942. The sensation is almost identical. A steady weight, a gentle sway, a low mechanical hum in the background, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of water. You can buy all of that now. You already have most of it. You are, quite possibly, lying under a version of it as we speak. The sea taught those men how to sleep, and they, without meaning to, taught the rest of us. But if the sea rocked its sailors to sleep, the sand did nothing of the kind, and neither did the jungle. The two most extreme climates of the war, the western desert of North Africa and the jungles of the Pacific and Burma, made sleep not a comfort, but a kind of combat in itself, a nightly wrestling match with temperature and insects and geography. And the tricks that came out of those places are some of the strangest and most human of the entire conflict. Begin in the desert. Begin in 1941, somewhere west of Cairo, on a long flat plain of gravel and sand, where the only landmarks are the wrecks of trucks and the occasional camel skeleton bleaching in the sun. Here, for nearly 3 years, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and the British 8th Army, first under Wavell, then Auchinleck, finally Montgomery, chased each other up and down a thin coastal strip, winning and losing the same stretch of ground so many times that some veterans afterwards could not remember which battle was which, only that there had been heat, and then cold, and then heat again, and very little sleep in between. The Western Desert is a sensory experience that modern travellers, even seasoned ones, find genuinely hard to describe. In the daytime, the air sits at 50 degrees Celsius, which is a number that means less to you than it should. Imagine opening an oven, putting your face inside it, and then walking around for 12 hours. The sand is white, the sky is white, the horizon dissolves. Flies settle on your eyelids and the corners of your mouth and will not leave no matter how many times you brush them away. Sand gets into your food, your weapons, your underwear, your ears, your teeth. And then, roughly 20 minutes after the sun goes down, the temperature drops, and it keeps dropping, until by 2 in the morning you are genuinely, dangerously cold, lying under the same sky, now suddenly clear and enormous, and full of more stars than you have ever seen in your life. This was the world the long-range desert group lived in from 1940 onwards. And from 1941, the Special Air Service under David Stirling joined them. These were men who drove hundreds of miles behind enemy lines in stripped-down Willys jeeps, carrying their own water, their own fuel, and their own sleep arrangements, because there was no tent large enough to be worth the trouble. Their technique was called, unofficially, the Desert Doze. You parked the jeep, you crawled underneath it, or up on top of it, depending on the sun. You draped a scrim net, a piece of loose, garnished camouflage netting, over yourself. You pushed a small wad of cotton wadding into your goggles to keep the flies out of your eyes, and you slept in the one narrow band of shade the jeep cast, moving with it as the sun crossed the sky, like a cat in a kitchen. Before sleep, every evening, there was tea. There was always tea. The British Army ran on tea in a way that is very difficult to explain to non-British people. And in the desert, the tea ritual had been refined to something approaching religious observance. It was called the Benghazi burner. You took an empty petrol tin or a biscuit tin or any scrap of metal that would hold its shape. You half filled it with sand. You poured in just enough petrol to soak the sand, not so much that it sloshed, not so little that it did not catch, and you lit it. The sand burned slowly and steadily, like a wick the size of a dinner plate, and on top of it you balanced a smaller tin full of water, and into the water went tea leaves, and, crucially, an absolutely unconscionable amount of sugar and a tin of condensed milk. The result was sweet, strong, hot, and the signal, morning and evening, that the day had begun or ended. You drank it squatting in the sand, and then you lay down, and the caffeine in that heat somehow did not keep you awake. The sugar did the work, the warmth did the work, the ritual did the work. You slept because your body had been told it was allowed to. Up the coast at Tobruk, from April to November 1941, the Australian 9th Division and their British and Indian comrades held the port against Rommel's best efforts for 240 days, and earned themselves the nickname, first used sneeringly by the German propagandist William Joyce, of the Rats of Tobruk. The Rats, being Australian, took the insult, painted it on their helmets, and got on with surviving. One of the ways they survived was an invention the British Army had never quite managed to come up with, and which the Australians, with their long national tradition of digging holes in hot places, produced almost as an afterthought. They called it, with characteristic tact, a wog hole. It was a deep, narrow dugout, roofed with scrap timber and sandbags, with a door made of wet Hessian sacking, burlap to the Americans, stretched across the entrance. During the day, you kept the Hessian wet. The desert wind blew through it, evaporation cooled the air on the inside, and the temperature in the dugout dropped by as much as 15 degrees below the surface air. It was, in the truest sense, a swamp cooler carved into a sand dune. And men slept in those dugouts through the worst afternoons of the siege, while a few feet above their heads the Luftwaffe went about its day. On the German side of the wire, the Afrika Korps developed its own little kindnesses. The Sahara sleep cap was not a cap at all. It was a square of white cotton, a handkerchief, a torn piece of shirt, soaked in the day's last clean water, wrung out until it was damp rather than wet, and draped over the face at bedtime. As the water evaporated, it cooled the skin of the forehead, which cooled the blood moving through it, which cooled very slightly the brain. Rommel's medical staff noted that men who did this fell asleep faster and woke less often. Rommel himself famously slept 4 hours a night in his uniform, boots placed neatly beside the cot, ready to move within 30 seconds of waking. It was a discipline that served him well in 1941 and 1942, and contributed almost certainly to the physical collapses that began to trouble him in 1943. And then there were the stars. The desert sky at night, in the absence of electric light, is a thing that stays with anyone who has seen it. Desert patrols, particularly the LRDG, taught their new recruits a strange quiet trick for the moments when sleep would not come. You lay on your back. You picked a constellation. You named its stars, one by one, out loud if you were alone, in your head if you were not. Orion, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Bellatrix, the Belt, the Sword. And then, if you were still awake, you moved on. You named the next constellation. You named its brightest star. The mind, busy with naming, let go of the things it had been worrying. It is nothing more, really, than a mantra with a star map. But it worked, and desert veterans carried the habit home. Long after the war, old men in English suburbs and Australian country towns lay on their backs in gardens in summer and quietly named the stars, and their wives, who did not know why, nevertheless understood that it meant their husbands were at peace. Now move east and change everything. Leave the desert with its clean, dry cold and its enormous sky, and step into the green. The Pacific and Southeast Asian theatres opened in the worst way imaginable in late 1941 and early 1942. Malaya overrun, Singapore falling in February 1942, the Philippines lost, the Great Retreat into Burma. And from there unfolded, island by island, river by river, the long wet agony of jungle war. Guadalcanal in August 1942. Kokoda across the spine of New Guinea. Buna, Gona, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Luzon. Burma under Slim and Wingate. And in every one of those places, the climate was the same. 100% humidity, rain that fell for hours and then fell for hours more, leeches on your boots, mosquitoes in clouds so thick you inhaled them, ants that stripped a corpse overnight, and the nocturnal sound of the jungle itself, which is not, contrary to the films, peaceful. It is a constant screaming, clicking, booming chaos. And somewhere out in that noise, very often, there were Japanese infantry infiltrators moving silently, waiting for you to close your eyes. Out of this, the United States Marine Corps in 1943 produced one of the quiet engineering triumphs of the war, the jungle hammock, designed by Major Lewis S. Bauer. It was a canvas sling with an integrated mosquito net, a waterproof rainfly stretched above it on a ridgeline, and tie-off points at both ends. You strung it between two trees. You climbed in, you zipped up the netting, you fell asleep 6 inches above the mud, dry, netted, and, relatively speaking, safe from the things that wanted to bite you. Marines who had tried to sleep in foxholes before the hammock arrived, and in hammocks after it arrived, were unanimous. It was, one of them wrote, the best piece of kit the Corps ever issued, not because it was clever, but because it let a man close his eyes. Deeper in the jungle, in Burma, old Wingate's Chindits were doing something stranger. Wingate was a difficult, brilliant, eccentric man who believed, among many other things, that a raw onion chewed slowly before bed kept the blood clean and the mind quiet, and he ate one every night of the campaign. His men, who mostly did not, had other rules. The most famous of them was the head-to-tail rule. Two men sleeping in the same bivouac slept with their heads at opposite ends, so that a Japanese infiltrator creeping in at 2 in the morning with a knife would see a confusing double silhouette. Two heads where there should have been one pair, and hesitate long enough for someone to wake. It is the kind of idea that only emerges when the cost of an ordinary mistake is absolute, and it saved lives. The Japanese infantryman had his own sleep world, and it was shaped by ritual as much as by tactics. Under his tunic, next to his skin, many a soldier wore a senin bari, the belt of 1,000 stitches, each one sewn by a different woman back home, a mother, a sister, a stranger on a street corner who had been handed the cloth and asked to contribute. You slept with that belt against your body, and you slept, therefore, inside 1,000 small prayers. You dug your bivouac in the form of a takotsubo, an octopus pot, a narrow round hole just deep enough to hold you sitting up. And you slept in it vertically, head on knees, because if the rain filled the pit, at least you would not drown in your sleep. And you did not wash, because in the Shinto and Buddhist mixed folk religion of the ordinary soldier, water on the body washed away the protection of one's ancestors, and you needed all the protection you could keep. Across the ridgeline, the Australians on the Kokoda track developed an adaptation that is almost impossible to believe until you read it in the diaries. They slept in 40-minute bursts, not because of the enemy, because of the leeches. A man who slept for more than 40 minutes on the track would wake with enough leeches attached that the blood loss over a week became genuinely debilitating. So every 40 minutes, someone would shake his neighbour. They would both sit up, run their hands over their bodies, pull the leeches off with a lit cigarette or a knife edge, and lie back down. For weeks. American and Commonwealth troops across the Pacific were taking atabrine, the synthetic anti-malarial that had replaced the unavailable quinine. And it did two things. It kept most of them alive. And it turned their skin, slowly, a faint and unmistakable yellow, and gave them vivid, elaborate, sometimes beautiful dreams. Men on Guadalcanal and in Burma woke with the memory of perfectly detailed conversations with grandmothers, of walking through houses they had never seen, of whole symphonies they could not afterwards write down. Atabrine dreams became a shared culture. You traded them in the morning the way other soldiers traded cigarettes, and the jungle, for all its horror, gave something back. It had a sound. The cicadas at dusk rose in a great pulsing wave that went on for an hour. The coal bird called, 2 notes over and over, all night. The frogs kept their count. Rain on a tent canvas, when it finally came, was the oldest white noise in the world, and men who had not slept in days fell into sleep inside 60 seconds of the first drop's landing. Soldiers who came home from the Pacific reported for the rest of their lives that they slept better in thunderstorms, and their families, once again, did not always know why. So, when we talk about far fronts, sand and jungle, the rats of Tobruk and the Chindits, the Benghazi burner and the jungle hammock, what we are really looking at is sleep stripped down to its absolute essentials. No mattress cover, no thread count, just shelter, safety, and breath. Give a human being those 3 things in any combination, in any climate on Earth, and they will find a way to close their eyes. Take any one of them away, and they will invent something, out of petrol and sand and hessian and netting and starlight, to put in its place. And sometimes, In the worst places of all, they had even less than that, and still they found a way. Because the war did not only happen in deserts and jungles and on the open sea. It happened for millions of people behind wire or under floorboards or in the cellars of houses that had belonged to somebody else the week before. It happened in camps, in safe houses, in sewer tunnels, in barns, in the back rooms of bakeries, in the narrow spaces between a false wall and a real one. And the people inside those spaces who had lost almost everything still needed every night to close their eyes. What they invented, in captivity, in resistance, in hiding, is perhaps the gentlest and most quietly astonishing part of the whole story. Let's begin with the airmen. Begin with Stalag Luft III, near Sagan, deep in what is now western Poland, the camp that would one day provide the setting for the Great Escape. The men inside it were Allied aircrew, shot down bomber crews, downed Spitfire pilots, navigators and gunners and flight engineers. And they had, on average, far more time to think than they had ever had in their lives. Too much time. Time is, as anyone who has lain awake at 3 in the morning knows, the enemy of sleep. And so, the Kriegis, as they called themselves, short for Kriegsgefangene, prisoners of war, set about engineering with the same quiet inventiveness their crews had applied to Lancasters and fortresses, a sleep world out of almost nothing. The Red Cross parcel pillow was a masterpiece of prisoner economy. A Red Cross food parcel, when emptied, left behind a cardboard box, wax paper, string, and, if you were lucky, a little wool padding from something breakable. The men flattened the cardboard, folded it into a rectangle, stuffed it with anything soft they could scavenge. Sock wool, pulled threads from a worn pullover, the stuffing from the shoulder of a battle dress blouse, and sewed it shut with thread pulled from a shirt hem. It was not soft, but it was a pillow. It lifted your head. It said, in the language the nervous system speaks, this is a bed, and you are allowed to rest. Before lights out, at the end of the long, slow days, there was tea. The tin can blower was a prisoner invention of real brilliance. A little forced draft stove made from a flattened Klim milk tin, a crank handle made from bed frame wire, a fan blade cut from the lid, and a firebox packed with shavings of whatever would burn. You cranked the handle, the fan blew, the fire roared, and within 90 seconds, a mug of water was boiling on top. Around that tin, at the end of the day, men gathered and they drank hot, weak tea made from twice-used leaves, and they told stories. Pat Reed at Kolditz, the fortress camp for repeat escapers, Oflag 4C, perched above the Mulde, wrote later that the prisoners developed a technique of mentally rehearsing escape routes as a sleep aid. You lay in your bunk and you walked yourself in exact detail through the route out. The 3rd floor to the 2nd, the 2nd to the chapel, the loose floorboard, the rope, the window. By the time you had walked yourself through the whole plan twice, you were asleep. It was a trick that doubled as preparation and sedation, which is the kind of economy only prisoners invent. There was a strange phenomenon the Kriegis called wire happiness. After months, sometimes years of captivity, some men arrived at a paradoxical deep peace in their sleep. The nervous system, having nothing left to fight, simply surrendered. They slept, these men, more soundly than they had on their own bomber bases. It was not happiness, really. It was something more like the exhaustion of hope, settled into something almost serene. And the senior British officers knew it and they protected it, and they maintained the old ritual of lights-out reading. Wodehouse, mostly. Bertie Wooster and Jeeves read aloud in a clipped upper-class voice in a wooden hut in the middle of Silesia, while men drifted off to the sound of Blandings and the Drones Club and the eternal comic disasters of a world that still, somewhere, existed. It is hard to read about without being quietly undone. In the Far East, the captivity was harder, and the sleep tricks were, of necessity, smaller and more tender. At Changi, at Chungkai, along the Burma Railway, at Cabanatuan in the Philippines, Allied prisoners of the Japanese lived on rice and whatever they could scavenge, and they died of disease and overwork in numbers that are still difficult to face. Inside those camps, there were men of astonishing kindness. Sir Ernest Edward Dunlop, Weary Dunlop, the Australian surgeon of the Thai-Burma Railway, made rounds every evening of the sickest men in his huts. He did not have medicine. He had a voice and a hand, and sometimes, on a good day, a spoonful of condensed milk he had stolen or bartered from a guard. He would lay his palm on a fevered forehead. He would hum a few bars of a tune. He would say a man's name and his wife's name and his children's names and the name of the town he came from. Men who survived the railway wrote, decades later, that a hand on the forehead from Weary Dunlop was the last thing they remembered before sleep, and that it had been, for them, the difference between living and not. The prisoners of the Japanese camps also developed the discipline of the mental banquet. After lights out, in whispered voices, one man would describe in perfect detail a meal. Not a meal he was going to cook, a meal he remembered. His mother's roast lamb with mint sauce and rosemary potatoes, the way she laid the table, the weight of the gravy boat, the smell when the oven door opened. The next night, another man would describe another meal. Christmas dinner in a farmhouse in Yorkshire, a clam bake on a beach in Maine, a Sunday lunch of satay and coconut rice in a kampong in Malaya. The rule was that you were not allowed to rush. You described everything. The men listening did not interrupt. They closed their eyes and they tasted what the speaker tasted, and by the end of the meal they were usually asleep. It sounds like it would hurt. Prisoners said afterwards that it did the opposite. It reminded them they had been loved. It reminded them the world still held those things. Somewhere, on the other side of the wire, somebody's mother was still making roast lamb, and one day, perhaps, they would be there again. The writer Lawrence van der Post, imprisoned at Sukabumi on Java, recorded something stranger still. In the long quiet of the nights, he noticed that dozens of men in his hut reported similar dreams. Dreams of rivers, dreams of gardens, dreams of walking through the same unfamiliar houses. Called it group dreaming. Whether it was a genuine shared phenomenon or simply the convergence of minds under identical conditions, no one can now say. But the men believed in it, and believing in it, they slept more gently, as though they were not alone, even in the darkness behind their own eyes. Move now from the camps into the hidden rooms. In July 1942, in an upper floor behind a bookcase in a narrow house on the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam, a girl called Anne Frank began to sleep differently. The rules of the secret annex were absolute. No toilet during the day, because the sound of the flush could be heard in the warehouse below. Whispering only. No footsteps. At night, when the warehouse workers had gone home, a little more latitude, but never much. Anne wrote in her diary of lying in her narrow bed at night and forcing herself to think of ice skating on a Dutch canal. The cold, clean wind on her face, the scrape of the blades, the long, flat horizon, until the image softened her enough to let her fall asleep. It is one of the most moving sleep tricks in all of recorded history. A 14-year-old girl in hiding, teaching herself to visualize freedom until she could rest. The Dutch onderduikers, the divers under, Jews and resistors and downed airmen hidden by Dutch families, slept in places you would not believe possible. Inside the cavities of grandfather clocks, under floorboards with breathing slits cut into the skirting, in haylofts behind false walls, in the crawl spaces above farmhouse kitchens where the warm air from the stove rose, and you could sleep for 2 hours at a time before the heat became too much. They slept fully dressed, always, boots on or boots beside them, because a midnight raid might come at any hour, and you had, at most, 30 seconds to decide whether to run or to be very, very still. The French maquis in the wooded uplands of the Vercors and the Limousin had their own rules. Never sleep in the same place twice. Boots as a pillow, because boots you could not afford to lose. A Sten gun across the chest, a whistle by the door, and a sentry rotation that allowed each man perhaps 4 hours of true sleep a night. The maquisards learned to sleep in the grey state between waking and not waking, aware of the forest around them, aware of the wind changing direction, aware of the dog that had not barked. It is a kind of sleep that stays in the body forever. And many of them, 40 years later, still could not sleep deeply in a quiet room. In Warsaw, in August and September and October of 1944, during the uprising, the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, fought block by block through a city the Germans were methodically destroying, and slept, when they slept at all, in basements and sewer tunnels. The mattress of newspaper was a Warsaw invention. You collected old newspapers. There were plenty, blown out of shattered buildings, and you layered them, 8 or 10 sheets thick, between yourself and the concrete. The paper insulated against the cold. It dried quickly when the sewers flooded. It could be burned in the morning for warmth or for tea. In the chapel of one cellar, the priest, Father Stanisław Trzeciak, moved among the sleepers at dusk and blessed each one with a thumb on the forehead. And the insurgents, most of them very young, slept beneath that blessing in the full knowledge that many of them would not wake. And then, finally, there were the agents. The men and women of the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's Set Europe Ablaze network, who were dropped by parachute into occupied France and Holland and Norway with a suitcase radio, a false identity, and a very small chance of coming home. Violette Szabo, Odette Sansom, nor Inayat Khan. They were trained at Beaulieu on Lord Montagu's estate in the New Forest, where the instructors taught them a set of sleep protocols unlike anything in the regular armed forces. You learned to sleep in 5-minute increments. You learned to wake at the sound of a floorboard a room away. You learned to keep a cyanide pill within reach, in a coat pocket, in a hem, in a signet ring. But never, the instructors were very clear, under the pillow. Because in your sleep, you might roll onto it, and you might wake already dying, and that was not how anyone wished to go. And they learned a drill. It was not called progressive muscle relaxation yet. That name, and the formal method belongs to the American physiologist Edmund Jacobson, whose work had been published in the 1930s and was still quietly making its way into clinical use. But the SOE instructors had a version of it, and they taught it to every agent before the drop. You lay on your back, you tensed your toes, held the tension for 10 seconds, and released. Then your calves, then your thighs, then your belly, your hands, your forearms, your shoulders, your jaw, your forehead. By the time you reached the top of your scalp, 10 minutes had passed, and every muscle in your body had been ordered individually to let go. Agents used it in cold barns in Normandy, in safe houses in Lyon, in the back bedrooms of farms in Denmark, and sometimes later in prison cells. It works. It still works. You could do it tonight. It is, more or less unchanged, the technique your sleep app calls body scan, and its wartime lineage is almost entirely forgotten. The Red Cross, in those years, did one more quiet thing. Through the International Committee in Geneva, and through broadcasts beamed into occupied Europe, they arranged for lullabies to be recorded and played on shortwave radio at certain hours of the night, in French, in Dutch, in Polish, in Norwegian. A child in hiding, or a refugee on a farm in the Pyrenees, could, at the right hour, find a woman's voice singing the same lullaby her mother had sung. It is almost unbearable to think about, and it is also one of the kindest things that has ever been organized in the middle of a war. What you notice when you sit with these stories long enough is that none of the tricks are clever. Not really. A hand on a forehead, a whispered meal, a mental image of ice skating, a blessing, a lullaby over a wireless, a muscle tensed and released. They are, all of them, simple acts of kindness, to another person or to oneself, to the nervous system, to the small frightened animal that lives inside every human being, and, when the world has gone mad, still needs, at the end of the day, to be told that it is safe enough to close its eyes. And somehow, in the cellars and the annexes and the camps and the safe houses, people kept finding ways to tell that small animal exactly that. Not because they had any reason to believe it, but because they were stubborn and they were tired, and sleep, when you can reach it, is the one thing that no one, no guard, no occupier, no war, can quite take away from you. And then, one morning, the war ended. On the 8th of May 1945, in Europe, and on the 15th of August that same year in the Pacific, the guns went quiet, and the world, for the first time in 6 years, prepared to sleep without them. What the diaries of that season record again and again is something nobody had expected. On the first peaceful nights, millions of people could not sleep at all. The silence was wrong. The absence of the drone of bombers, of the crump of distant artillery, of the rattle of the all clear, the absence of all of it pressed on the ears like a held breath. Veterans sat up in their childhood beds at 3 a.m, listening for something that was not coming. Londoners lay in their own sheets, in their own rooms, and found themselves missing, of all things, the underground. It took weeks, in some cases years. In some cases it never quite went away. But the tricks did not die. That is the quiet miracle at the end of this story. The 120-second sleep method, taught in a Navy pre-flight school in 1942, travelled, almost unchanged, into a 1981 book by a track coach named Lloyd Winter, called Relax and Win, and from there into every listicle you have ever read about how to fall asleep fast. The progressive muscle relaxation drilled into SOE agents at Beaulieu found its full clinical form in Edmund Jacobson, and then in Herbert Benson's relaxation response, and now lives on your phone as a guided body scan. The red lights of American submarines became the red sleep bulbs sold in every wellness shop. The paratrooper's slow 4-in, hold, 8-out breath was refined by Dr. Andrew Weil in the 1990s into the 478 technique. The Finnish lump of butter before sleep echoes in every modern article about ketogenic bedtime snacks. Weighted blankets descend, in spirit, from the memory of a heavy wool greatcoat. Even the humble foam earplug can trace its ancestry back to a London housewife pressing candle wax into cotton wool on the platform at Bethnal Green. What you notice, when you lay them all out, is how stubborn and ordinary and gentle they are. Warmth, rhythm, breath, a familiar sound, a small ritual, a hand on a forehead, a story whispered in the dark. The soldiers and sailors and airmen, the nurses and prisoners and resistors, the mothers in shelters and children in attics. They were not sleep scientists. They were exhausted human beings with tired bodies and frightened nervous systems, and they discovered, one small kindness at a time, that sleep is never conquered. It is only ever coaxed. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, with the soft weight of your own blanket, and the quiet of your own room, and nothing at all to be afraid of, notice those luxuries for a moment. They were earned. 80 years ago, in foxholes and hammocks and cellars and annexes, a whole generation of quietly competent people learned how to fall asleep under impossible conditions, and then they handed those small acts of kindness forward through the decades into your pillow. Close your eyes now. Let the stories stay with you. The night is long and you are safe, and that is the greatest gift of all. Good night.